All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us here on the I Believe podcast. I'm sure there will be a few people joining in live, and if you're catching the recording, thank you for catching the recording. I'm actually here with Cynthia Hayes, who's the author of The Big Ordeal, and I'm going to introduce her in just a couple minutes, so hang tight. But just to run through a couple announcements, I just want to make sure that you guys are aware of the different 5Ks that we have going on this year. Currently, we have 3 of them that are up for registration or will be up for registration really, really soon, like by the end of this week, early next week. You can find those information, or the site for the information on those 5Ks at lookinforacure.org. And you can find one in Scottsdale, Arizona, with virtual and in-person options, as well as Dallas, Texas. Scottsdale's happening September 24th. Dallas, Texas is November 5th. And then we have another one that's going to be finalized and up for registration very soon, if it's not already there, for LA, for the LA area. And that's on November 12th. So save the date for that. We do currently have 3 of those that should be up and running for registration or will be very, very soon. We would love to have you join us in person. So thank you for those of you on the ground who are helping with volunteering, helping with getting things situated, and who are registering and telling your friends and family. It means the world, and it's definitely going to be really awesome to see the impact that these 5Ks can make. Lastly, our I Believe seminar is coming up really fast, you guys. September is right around the corner, and our I Believe seminar is actually October 14th and 15th, and it's in Nashville. But I do want to make sure that you guys understand and everyone knows that there is a virtual option. So if for some reason you're unable to travel due to medical, or it just isn't the right time for you to travel, please join us virtually. We would love to see you. I'm going to be there in person, as well as most of the board and the rest of the ACIS team. But if you are able to join us virtually, please do so. Get registered. And if you are planning to join us in person and you have not registered yet, then make sure that you go ahead and get your registration taken care of, get your flights, get your hotels situated. We are so excited to see you guys in Nashville. That's all I have for announcements. So give me just a minute, and I'm going to bring up Cynthia so that she's ready to go, and I'm going to introduce her. So Cynthia is someone that I actually met at ASCO, and we happened to kind of run into each other when she was, I think, at one of the booths in the patient advocacy area. And she's actually a former journalist and a Harvard-trained management consultant and a hospital executive, and she is the author of The Big Ordeal, Understanding and Managing the Psychological Turmoil of Cancer. Since recovering from her own ordeal, she has helped to raise awareness of the shared emotional experience of cancer, the physical drivers of that experience, and how to cope with it all. When not speaking or writing about cancer emotions, she volunteers as a peer mentor to newly diagnosed patients, is an avid tennis player and an adventure traveler, and she lives in New York City with her adoring husband and their Shih Tzu puppy. Definitely so excited to have her to join in and talk to us about the emotional turmoil that a cancer diagnosis can introduce. And I hope for those of you who are joining live that you will drop any questions that you have. Ask us really pretty much anything, and make sure that if you are wanting to read her book, to head over to anywhere that you can purchase a book and grab The Big Ordeal so that you can start learning a little bit more. So Cynthia, I'm going to go ahead and just have you take it away and tell us a little bit more about what was your journey maybe with cancer like, and what led you to writing this book.
Oh, well, thank you, Danette, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that people will write in with questions, because this should be a dialogue as much as it is a presentation. And, you know, as Danette said, I am a cancer survivor, not ocular melanoma, but rather I had endometrial cancer, and my diagnosis came totally out of the blue. I had been to see my gynecologist for a regular checkup. I was walking down the street a week later when my cell phone rang. I looked at the phone and it said the gynecologist's office. I assumed it was the billing department, because why would they be calling me? I had no issues. Everything was fine. I was healthy. But no, my doctor said there were some blah cells on my pap smear. And I just didn't give it another thought. But she said, you know what, get yourself in here. I want to do another test. Let's just check this out. I was on my way to get a manicure done. I was going out that night. My daughter was with me. We were, focused on getting all dolled up for the big event tonight. And when I got to the manicurist, I had just a few seconds before she needed my hands, which was long enough to Google what those blah cells were that the doctor mentioned. And it was like, holy crap, I'm going to die of cancer. And it was just an instantaneous reaction. And of course, I didn't die of cancer. I had a very aggressive form of endometrial cancer with a history of poor outcomes. But because of a luckily well-timed pap smear, I caught the cancer early, and after a radical hysterectomy and 6 months of chemo, was told NED, no evidence of disease. So I like to say dancing with Ned. You never know when Ned's going to step on your toes, but for the moment, Ned and I are having a good time. And I found the whole experience of cancer to be surprisingly challenging. I was surprised by the suddenness of the diagnosis. I was surprised by the roller coaster of emotions that I experienced. I was surprised by who showed up and who didn't show up. There was just a lot of surprises. And there was one day when I was towards the end of my treatment. I was at the gym. I was bald. Treatment, 6 months of chemo. Chemo was Taxol and paclitaxel, nasty drugs that kill all fast-growing cells, including every single hair cell, hair follicle on your body. So bald as a cue ball, and at the gym, weak as can be, trying desperately to make the pedals of a stationary bicycle go around. And I was approached by a total stranger who came up and sat on the bike beside me and started telling me his cancer story. And he had had melanoma 15 years earlier, and started sharing some of the very same things, the incredible shock at the diagnosis, the instant panic and assumption that he was going to die, the lack of comprehension of those around him, and the struggles that he had with his own emotions, as well as interacting with others who didn't necessarily understand what it was he was going through. And it was really in talking with him that I had this sense of, my God, why is it that we all feel so isolated in our diagnosis and that nobody understands us, when in fact there is such a universal response? And of course, it wasn't just from one conversation, but as I started talking to other people, it became clear that there was this almost universal emotional volatility and an almost universal sense of isolation. And because our medical system is not really set up to deal with emotional issues at the same time as physical issues, and because there are no conversations about the emotional impact of cancer, we don't know that what we are experiencing is actually typical. It's not necessarily normal in that it's not necessarily a healthy response, but it is normal in that it is a common and typical thing. So based on that, I ended up talking to over 100 patients, a bunch of caregivers, a number of experts in all sorts of fields, and really tried to understand, well, what do we experience? Why do we experience that? And what can we do about it? How can we make it a little bit more manageable? And my goal behind all of this was to really sort of raise the level of conversation around the fact that cancer is an emotional diagnosis as much as it is a physical one, and that we should understand that so that we're comfortable talking about the emotions. And cancer is emotional for a bunch of different reasons. And let's start with the fact that there are a bunch of external things that sort of drive our emotions. Starting with that for millennia, a cancer diagnosis has been a death sentence. There were no cures for most cancers, and you were going to die. And it was a question of, well, is this a fast-growing cancer and a short death sentence, or a slow-growing cancer and a long death sentence? And of course, that's no longer true. There are great treatments for many cancers, and the survival rate for most cancers is really pretty strong. But we still remember that death sentence, and that is baked into so much of our history and media and culture that, of course, it is there when we first hear those words, you've got cancer. There's also, I think, a greater sense of responsibility associated with a cancer diagnosis than with many other diagnoses. I mean, if you are diagnosed with Parkinson's, it's like, well, I didn't do anything to cause that, so I don't feel guilty. But somehow with cancer, it's like, oh, well, I didn't use enough sunscreen, I smoked cigarettes, I haven't exercised enough, I didn't wear sunglasses. I mean, whatever, we give ourselves a number of reasons to believe that we're responsible for our own cancers, and that also contributes to our emotional vulnerability around it. There's also a tremendous societal stigma around mental health, and so we don't talk about mental health issues. We don't talk about the fact that depression is pretty common, not just in cancer, but in general. We don't talk about the fact that that some of us have experiences as a child that stay with us throughout our lives and make us more susceptible to stress than others. So because we don't have conversations about mental health, we don't understand exactly how common mental health issues are. Add to that the fact that when you are diagnosed, it's usually by a specialist or somebody who you have a brand new relationship with. So it's not your family GP who is holding your hand through your cancer experience, but rather it is a stranger who all of a sudden you have to put yourself in the hands of. Then there's the complexity of the diagnosis, where it can take a while from the first time somebody says, ooh, there's something a little suspicious here, until you actually know what your diagnosis is, what type of cancer you have, what the treatment plan is going to be, and what your prognosis is. That's a long period of waiting and uncertainty and confusion, and that's when our emotions really get the best of us. And then, of course, in this day and age, our medical care is so specialized that the doctor who sees you, is like focused on the cancer, not focused on the human being. And there are rare doctors out there who look beyond the cancer and see you as a patient, but it's much more normal to have, a 10-minute visit, a 20-minute visit, maybe if you're lucky, an hour visit, but rarely a whole person visit. So those external forces really contribute to the emotional volatility. But there's also a bunch of stuff going on internally that really make cancer a very volatile time for us. And part of that has to do with something that, it took a neuroscience a scientist to help me understand, which is that there's an inflammatory response in our bodies as a result of the presence of cancer. And that inflammatory response is useful in that it is part of the conversation that our immune system has with itself in order to bring the right resources to help resolve any sort of problem in the body. So you get a paper cut and you have a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines that all of a sudden are running around in your body saying, oh my God, we're going to let an infection in. We got to get more platelets there and seal that up. We got to get
I'm
more.
just picturing all the cells doing this.
And the white blood cells have to get there to fight infection, and then extra red blood cells have to get there because we've lost some red blood cells. So all of that is coordinated by cytokines, and the pro-inflammatory cytokines bring the inflammation to heal the wound, and the anti-inflammatory cytokines say, okay, we're good now, let's back away. But if a paper cut can do that, imagine what major surgery can do. And it turns out that the presence of cancer actually causes an inflammatory response. And most cancer treatments, so radiation, surgery, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, even some immunotherapies are even cytokine therapies. So we're awash in cytokines. And what the neuroscientist explained to me is that when too many pro-inflammatory cytokines are washing through our body, some of them pass the blood-brain barrier, and the brain perceives that excess of pro-inflammatory cytokines as, oh, we are sick. We had better climb back into bed and pull the covers over our heads, because if that lion comes chasing us across the prairie, we are not going to be able to get away. And it's that sickness behavior that ends up driving a lot of our emotional experience. So it's not that we are weak, pathetic creatures that can't deal with the reality that we have cancer, but rather, no, there is a physical
It's more
driver.
like a biological, that biological driver of like, this is what nature tells, the cells to do. I think I read somewhere that like or maybe I was listening to a book, I think I was listening to Radical Remission by Kelly Turner, but she said something about how when animals are sick, it doesn't matter what they're sick with, they will stop eating and they only drink water and they sleep a lot. Yeah. And those are like, they're just natural biological responses to dealing with, to the body and dealing with and healing from sickness in some way. So that makes complete sense to me, but I've never heard it explained that way, that it's those inflammatory markers that then become part of the blood-brain barrier and they get mixed in there and they just go like, okay, you're just so tired. Like we need to rest.
We just need to rest. We just need to climb back into bed and pull the covers over our head. And that's it. But in addition to all of that inflammatory stuff making our emotions a little wacky, there are often hormonal changes as a result of cancer and cancer treatment, whether it is the surgical removal of, in my case, ovaries, whether it is a chemical suppression of testosterone because you've got prostate cancer, whether it is as a result of chemotherapy suppressing your hormones, or maybe as part of your treatment, you're getting dexamethasone. Steroids like dexamethasone are often used as part of a treatment because they stimulate the body to not have an allergic reaction to this toxin that we're being introduced to, but also they help the body recover from treatment, and they're often used in both chemotherapy and in radiation treatment. But dexamethasone is a steroid, so jacks us up. We feel great for a couple of days. We taper off. We feel really bad for a couple of days. So I was really surprised. I had chemo on Thursday. Friday, I felt great because I was full of the dexamethasone. I was ready to run a marathon. Saturday and Sunday, I would be nauseous and lying on the couch because that's what this particular chemo did for me. And on Monday, I would want to cry all day long. And it was only after talking with the neuroscientist that I came to understand that that's the dexamethasone leaving your system. So just a lot of volatility. And then add to that the incredible stress you're going through at the time of your diagnosis and the fatigue that sets in as a result of treatment and the presence of the disease. So we have a lot of stuff going on that makes us emotional. And of course, our emotions influence our physical health too. If we are emotionally volatile, we are less likely to adhere to our medical treatment. If we are experiencing pain or side effects, those sensations can be amplified by our emotional volatility. And of course, we can't deal with day-to-day life if we are feeling depressed, if we are worried about the anxiety of is the cancer going to come back. And so, those emotions can influence our ability to even, continue to work and maintain the insurance we need.
To sleep, to
eat, to sleep,
all of those things.
Yeah. And then, of course, they color our entire experience of cancer. What I found in talking to hundreds of patients is that, in fact, the emotional patterns are somewhat predictable, even though we all express them differently. In fact, from the time of diagnosis through recovery and or end of life, emotions are pretty predictable. And because we are all different, they vary in intensity and timing and how we might express them. Because they are likely to be influenced by both our pre-cancer and cancer experiences, by our DNA, our personality, our prognosis, how much pain we're experiencing, and how much knowledge or rapport and communication we have with our medical team that can help us in expressing and understanding our emotions. So just looking at this chart, the orange and pink roller coasters, that's fear and stress and anxiety. I don't know how large it is on your screen, but the fear roller coaster, the orange, is highest when we're first diagnosed. And it begins to drop a little bit at the time of we've made a decision about our care and we're going to start treatment. But it can continue to build throughout the entire experience, and particularly peaking if, in fact, we have a recurrence or we're progressing towards the end of life. And the same with stress and anxiety, the pink roller coaster. It builds enormously as we focus on the fact that, oh my God, not only do I have cancer, but now I have to make a decision about what I'm going to do about my cancer and how I'm going to move forward. It can lessen as we feel like we're being taken care of, and it can then build again if we have a recurrence or a progression. But each stage along the process, or each phase along the process, also comes with its own unique emotions. So at the time of diagnosis, for most of us, for most of us, we have tremendous sense of disbelief, in addition to that fear and anxiety. And it's like, how can I possibly be being diagnosed with cancer? How is this happening? And for many of us, a cancer diagnosis comes totally out of the blue. It's like we don't anticipate that we're going to get cancer. Maybe there was a family history, but we say, oh no, I'm healthy, I'm fine. So that disbelief and panic are pretty common. At decision time, the next step in the process, often what we experience is a tremendous sense of information overload. And somehow we manage, most of us, to switch into a hyper-efficiency mode where we suddenly turn off those emotions enough to engage in the process of decision making, and that's hard. That's
hard, but I feel like it, like you pointed out in the fear roller coaster, like it makes that fear, because you kind of stifle those emotions to effectively make a decision. The fear goes down so that you can make an educated decision. You can take in that information as much as you can. I've heard so many patients talk about how they feel like they become an expert almost overnight in their own care. And it's this intake, this influx of information that is it's so rapid, because like you said, sometimes you have 20, 30 minutes with a doctor at the time of diagnosis, and they're just like, they just have all of the information. They're like an encyclopedia, and they just spit it all out. And somehow you either absorb it fully or it kind of goes over you and all you hear is cancer. But when it's decision-making time, you're taking it in. So I don't know. I felt like a sponge. I just felt like I was just absorbing everything. And it was that feeling of overwhelming is there for sure. But at the same time, that hyper efficiency of getting things done and making decisions and calling and making phone calls, having all of the scans that happen, the follow up to check for cancer elsewhere. It's such a big endeavor. That first, really, at least for us in this community, it's about the first month to maybe the first 2 months that is really, really in depth, high speed, lots of things are happening, and you're just really having to get on the roller coaster and go with it, or
go with it.
Yeah. There's really no other alternative.
That's right. And then once you make that decision and you start treatment, for many patients, there is a tremendous sense of relief that, oh my God, okay, finally, somebody is dealing with my cancer. I can put myself in the hands of somebody who can take care of me. But it's often accompanied by a tremendous sense of isolation, because now you have had to own the fact that you have cancer. There's no distraction of, getting more scans and second opinions and whatnot. It's like, nope, I am fully on the cancer bus. And that's when, for many patients, the sense of isolation really hits hard. And it's also when we feel like we are handing our lives over to cancer, and that we no longer have control over anything in our lives. We are now going to march to cancer's time schedule. And for me, that meant surgery within 2 weeks of my diagnosis, and I was signed off as healed and ready for the next step 3 weeks later, and I got myself on I got myself on. The doctor said, you will start on chemotherapy, and it will be every 3 weeks, and that was my life for 6 months. It's like, okay, this is what I have to do. I had no control over it. literally no control. And that's a pretty typical experience. As treatment continues, what happens is the fatigue sets in, the depression often sets in. Sometimes there's cognitive impairment as, people talk about chemo brain or cancer fog. I mean, lots of different words for it, but really it's a combination of stress and not sleeping well and all those cytokines screwing around with your brain and sometimes a little extra, cell death because you're being radiated or getting infusions or whatever. But mostly it has an awful lot to do with in the inflammatory response and stress and sleep. Often there's a tremendous sense of helplessness that sets in as well. In the middle of treatment, you don't really know, is it working? Am I going to be well? Am I going to recover? What's my prognosis? Where do things go from here? So throughout the process, and sometimes, in the middle of treatment, sometimes when treatment is done, sometimes, every 3, 6, 12 months for a long time, we have testing and monitoring. And for some cancers, that means a PT. Sometimes it means a blood test. Sometimes it means a CT scan. Whatever the cancer and testing combination
just
is.
That monitoring cycle is different. I mean, it's different, but it's in some sense universal. That there is always something of you're now on cancer watch for pretty much the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that invokes a tremendous sense of anxiety. We talk about scanxiety among those of us who have regular scans. It's this tremendous fear that comes up again. We can not think about it for weeks or months at a time, and then all of a sudden there's a scan or a blood test on the calendar, and it's like, oh my God, I am a cancer patient. I am a survivor so far, but is that cancer back? Ned hasn't stepped on my toes lately, but is he going to step on my toes this time? So that tremendous fear and anxiety just come back in spades. When
it really just pulls you right back into maybe the uncertainty you've been able to get some space from and that you've taken a break from really acknowledging or just really sitting with. It kind of just makes a house and it says, nope, I'm here. Deal with me.
Deal with me. Now, many of us are lucky enough to skip over the next 2 steps in the process, but for those who do have a recurrence or a progression, one of the most common emotions is anger. There was one patient I interviewed who was a minister, and he said when he heard that his cancer was back, he was railing, not just at the medical community, not just at the scientists who hadn't found a cure for his particular cancer, but at God himself. Why is this happening to me? And I think that that's a relatively common experience, to have this tremendous anger that the treatment and everything that you went through already didn't work, that the cancer is back. And then also tremendous sadness and resignation that, oh my God, this is my life now. This is what I have to anticipate, that the cancer can come back, that the cancer might always be with me, might always be influencing my life. And if in fact that recurrence or progression leads towards end of life, what befalls most patients is a tremendous sense of frustration, depression, sense of guilt that maybe they didn't do enough to better their situation, a loss of sense of purpose, and anger still, denial often, acceptance eventually, and tremendous grief. Those of us who are lucky enough to skip over that secondary high bump, we get to end of treatment, and you would think, okay, celebrate, break open the champagne. We're glad, we're all done. But for many patients, that's actually a scary time and accompanied by a tremendous sense of loss, because you had this community while you were a cancer patient. You had all of the people that were looking at you on a regular basis. You had all of the people that were dropping by with meals or, can I take care of your child? Can I babysit for a while? Let me hold your hand for a moment. Let me bring you flowers. And all of a sudden, they disappear because they figure, oh, well, you're well, you finished, you're good. Life goes back to normal, but life isn't back to normal. We are so far from normal. And in fact, it takes somewhere between 6 and 18 months for our bodies to heal, depending upon the amount of treatment and how healthy and fit we were before treatment began. But during that extended period of 1 to 2 years, we feel abandoned by both the medical community and our home support team, and yet so not ourselves, so not ready to jump back into life. Eventually, we get through the physical healing and get to some emotional healing. And for some of us, that emotional healing brings a sense of maybe that I can find some benefit, that I gain something, some post-traumatic growth that happens as a result of the cancer experience. And for most of us, it does include okay, this is my new normal. I can deal with this. There is still this risk, but in fact, there was always that risk I was going to get hit by that proverbial bus. And so let me just find a way to work this into my life and get on with living. So that's a pretty typical emotional roller coaster ride. And of course, the bigger question is, well, what do we do about it? How do we manage it? And how do we get on with our lives?
Yeah.
And I like to tell the patients that I mentor, look, there's no right way to cope. There's only the way that works for you. So there are techniques that, help some people manage stress. They're might work for you, and what works for you today might not work for you tomorrow. Some of us rely only on ourselves. Others like to rely on family and friends and peer support and professional intervention. But it's helpful to have a bunch of different, arrows in your quiver, if you will. And so I like to remind people that there are really 3 categories of coping. There's coping by doing, active coping, and that involves everything from sleep and diet and exercise and socializing and laughing. Laughing and hugging are really good. Whenever you can, find a way to laugh, find a way to hug somebody, because they release positive chemicals in our brains, endorphins and oxytocin that stimulate positive thoughts and healing in our brain. So those are sort of the active ways of coping. There's also coping by thinking, and some of us are much more cerebral than others. For me, it's all about problem solving. How much research can I find? How can I understand what's going on? How can I break the problem down into manageable pieces? And that also means finding distractions. And so because I am cerebral, I would have to go down, a really compelling novel or, some other way of engaging my brain so that I wouldn't be constantly cycling back on, oh my God, there's only a 40% chance I'm going to survive this cancer. And then lastly, there are the mind-body coping mechanisms. And, yoga and meditation have become much more common over the past couple of years as we've all had to cope with COVID and whatnot. But beyond meditation and yoga, there's also just prayer. There is Tai Chi and Qigong and other modalities of exercise that require us to be both in our bodies full time. But there are also things like knitting. Knitting, where you have to repeat the pattern to yourself, whether it is knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. While your hands are busy, your whole body is engaged. And so anything like that, singing in the choir, whatever it is that involves both your mind and your body at the same time is a great coping mechanism. Again, it just doesn't allow you to, be thinking about the cancer.
For sure. Oh, I love breaking it down. I like how you broke it down into those three categories of the active, the cerebral, and the mind-body connections, as far as coping mechanisms, because I think it's helpful just to, like you said at the beginning, like to realize there's really no perfect right way to cope. Everyone is going to cope differently. But the whole general overarching theme is, we do have to deal with those emotions. Because I guess I know for me, like, I think they manifest in my body differently. If I don't allow space for them to talk about them, to write about them, to, do something with them, whether it's, to laugh, to sing, to do meditation, any of those kinds of things. If I don't allow space for something like that, even in small quantities, then I end up feeling more of like kind of some of the cycles that you talked about earlier in the roller coaster of the tiredness and the overwhelm. And I feel like I at least tend to kind of revert back to some of those old parts of the cycle that I would so much rather, not live in. Because I've already lived it. Like, I don't want to live it again if I can avoid it. Right. But just recognizing that I think the cycle will come up, maybe not in quite as high of levels, but that there still will be, some of these waves, especially with things like monitoring scans. And if there's anything that comes up in blood work, anything that comes up on your scans, anything that really changes that causes that kind of momentary, like, okay, like our body kind of has that response of like, could this be it? Could this be the thing that I've been dreading? Could it turn out to be nothing? Like, there's just all of those kind of what ifs bounce around, like, just like they ricochet. And I feel like just recognizing those roller coasters still will come during even the emotional healing phase. And I think that the emotional healing, like, I know it's in your graphic, it's at the end, but I think sometimes the emotional healing can happen throughout. Like, and it can happen in waves, and then you'll have another wave that goes up, and then you'll have, some more emotional healing. And I don't know how much you know about ocular melanoma, but I'll just briefly summarize just to kind of like help you see like just how fast paced this can be just for OM patients, and how quickly you get to this place of, even though you have, maybe some community of other patients who are going through it as well because of the gift of social media. I mean, most of us go through treatment and are considered done with eye treatment within 1 to 2 months. And then we're right on to monitoring scans, and it's just that constant monitoring. And for most of us, it's monitoring for really the rest of our life, but we're focused on the next 5 to 10 years is most of our experience. And when we're focused on that next 5 to 10 years, like it's really just like, we're just trying to see, like, can we just be here in 10 years? Can we just be like living in here in 10 years, like regardless of anything else? And then if you have anything else that changes in between that, whether or not it's, metastases or something else happens in your life health-wise that you have to deal with, it is exacerbated, I think, by just kind of it's just such a rapid spike, and then it comes straight back down, and then it levels out until you have scans, and it does this. And like, there can kind of definitely feel like this space of, I'm just surviving this. So like, how do I sit and cope with that when I'm so caught up in just surviving it? And I liked that you gave the point of realizing that it can take up to like 2 years to recover from the trauma of the initial treatment, and
from the physical trauma. Yeah.
From just the physical trauma,
much longer.
And yes, like, but like for the physical trauma to subside, for the things like the symptoms of fatigue to go away that are the consequence of that inflammatory response, that's something it makes sense to me, but I've never heard it put that way. And so for that to like subside, like it's I guess immensely validating to hear that like it's pretty normal for it to take a while. Even when you think of, it's really not small. I think because the eyeball is a small area, we tend to think like, oh, it's such a small surgery. But no, like, it's a major surgery. Whether you have proton beam therapy, whether you have laser therapy, whatever is happening to your body, it is still a major surgery, and your body needs time to recover from that. And it needs the time to recover from that on an emotional level as well. And that all of those take time. And I think just allowing us that space to realize that time is important.
Yeah, it can be really hard to give yourself the grace to do that, to allow yourself the time that it takes. And, we're all different. Our bodies, don't all function on, the same level. And so it can really take time. And just because, the doctor says, well, you should be fine by now. If you're not feeling fine, you're not feeling fine. I like to remind patients that, you're the only expert in you. You're the only one who knows what it's like inside your body. And so I often encourage patients to really advocate for themselves with their doctors about, I'm not feeling well yet. Why is that? What's going on? And I also like to, really stress the benefit of exercise in recovery and coping. And I'm not an exercise physiologist, and I am a latecomer to the exercise junkie world. I am the lamest of my siblings. I can't say that I grew up exercising, but I did come to understand that exercise helps to reduce stress. It helps to improve your mood. It helps to support a healthy immune system. It helps to level those cytokines. And it has been shown in a number of cases to speed recovery, to reduce recurrence, and to help manage side effects, including pain. And whether it is aerobic exercise or weight training or some sort of low intensity exercise, going for a brisk walk, which through most of my chemo meant I could walk 2 city blocks, but it built up from there. As soon as the doctor says, yeah, it's okay to exercise, I encourage people to exercise. It makes such a huge difference in our physical recovery and in our emotional recovery.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for pointing that out and just kind of drawing attention to that. That's something that we have tried to focus on as an organization. This year we started with Steps for Sight. It was our first annual Steps for Sight, and it was a virtual walk, just encouraging people get your 7,000 plus steps a day. And it was awesome to see how many people came together and banded together to do that, both for themselves and, symbolic of the patients who've been diagnosed worldwide with ocular melanoma. But it really is a testament, I think, to just how beneficial exercise is to improve our mood, improve all of these physical things that you mentioned. But I think in terms of emotional coping as well, that exercise can really help with processing those emotions. You can channel that emotion into the exercise sometimes when it's, that anger, that resentment, that frustration. Those can all be processed through exercise too, which is definitely an effective way to do that. Yeah. And like you said, exercise doesn't have to be the same for everyone. Everyone's body is going to benefit from different things. And finding what works for you is what's important for sure. Well, Cynthia, as we kind of close up, is there anything specific that you kind of are wanting to end with? If you wanted to if we were going to wrap up in the next 5 or so minutes.
The only other thing I would like to add is that often our relationships take a hit when we have cancer. And they take a hit because of the added stress that the patient and loving care partners are experiencing, each in their own way. A loving care partner can be every bit as afraid of a patient's health as the patient is, and also afraid of how am I going to keep the household running? How am I going to do X, Y, and Z while the patient is undergoing all of this? Will the patient be here, a year from now to help me in whatever? So that there's a lot going on in our closest relationships when cancer's in the picture. And it's not uncommon for patients to withhold a little bit of what we're experiencing from those around us. And we keep that to ourselves because we don't want to admit that we're weak. Oh, and to that one, I only cried in the shower. We don't want to overly burden our care partners who are already carrying so much. We think we're unjustified in our emotions. Whatever it is, we tend to keep a little bit to ourselves. And if we are keeping a little bit to ourselves and our care partners are keeping a little bit to themselves, all of a sudden this relationship has a little wedge in it, and that little wedge gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And it can be really hard to build that relationship back to where it was pre-cancer. some relationships don't survive a cancer diagnosis, but those that recognize that there have been challenges to the relationship, and after the crisis of cancer has subsided enough that we're able to own our feelings a little bit better, we're able to recognize the importance of the relationship and how it may have been damaged, we can build that back. But it starts with recognizing that this is a relatively common experience, and that there are special challenges to our intimate relationships as a result of a diagnosis. So I like to highlight that because, again, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of you didn't do your relationship right. It's a common thing during cancer, and it's something that, again, we don't talk about when we talk about cancer, but is almost always there.
Oh, it's cutting out for just a sec. Hopefully it's going to come back. Okay, I hear you back. The good news is the studio is really good at catching things despite any glitches. So, but thank you for addressing that. I think that is something that can be very challenging, especially if you feel like those relationships change and evolve, or like you said, some relationships just don't survive, whether it's friendships, family relationships. There can be really big changes, and that can add to the emotional burden that this, like you said, this big ordeal becomes. That it has a lot of layers to it, and just acknowledging that those are there and that they're really worth acknowledging, and that they do need to be dealt with, and that they do affect us in different ways, and that it's okay, like to see that and to humanize that, I think is really what I hope people can take away from this. Is just that, being human is not the problem. Being human is not the problem. We all experience emotions. We all have this roller coaster. And like you said, everyone's experience is going to look a little different. Everyone's circumstances will be different, but the general feelings and the emotions and the roller coaster ride is universal to this diagnosis. So thank you, for validating that for us and just for explaining that. I loved your explanation of the inflammatory response and how that crosses the blood-brain barrier. I've never heard that before. So that was so cool to me. But if you guys are able to, if you're listening live, if you're listening to the recording, feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and I will make sure to tag Cynthia over on our Facebook page. And then if she has a moment, or if we can just respond to questions there. We actually don't have time for questions right now, but if we do have a moment to just answer questions back and forth online, or as you guys have anything that comes up, you can find Cynthia on Instagram and also on Facebook, I believe. Do you want to go ahead and tell us those Facebook pages, and I'll include them in the show notes?
Sure. You can find me both at Cynthia Hayes and at 𝙾𝙘𝙀𝙀. And the book, again, is The Big Ordeal, Understanding and Managing the Psychological Turmoil of Cancer, by me and a couple of co-authors who provided great scientific underpinnings to much of what's discussed in the book. And I'll also have a website, 𝙏𝙝𝙚𝙀𝙝.com. There's a tremendous amount of information and patient stories and insights from medicine. And it's free. You don't have to buy a book, and you can learn a lot. So I hope you'll come and check it out.
Well, thank you. I will make sure to include that in the show notes. So if you guys are checking this out via the podcast, feel free to check it out. And then I'll add this to the YouTube link and the Facebook as well, so that you guys can find the book, you can find her website, and you can find her social media connections. But Cynthia, thank you again for being here. Thank you for just validating this experience for all of us and teaching us something. And I hope that everyone can take this and apply it in their life in some way, in coping with these emotions and recognizing them, and just accepting that they're part of the process, and that they are. It's okay to acknowledge them. They're not the big, we don't have to have it be the big elephant in the room that is ignored, like you said, with this stigma of mental health. So thank you again for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, you guys, we will see you next time.